One quiet night, as I sat beside my 21-year-old son, I noticed him shift slightly closer, quietly seeking reassurance in my presence. I could sense he needed comfort and support, but I sensed he was holding onto something deeper, something he wasn't sure how to express. My name is Emily. I'm 40 years old. I've raised Jack on my own since his father, David, left for an extended assignment overseas. We've always been close, but that night I sensed something new in our relationship. Unspoken feelings of uncertainty and vulnerability we had not previously navigated. What would you do if someone you love struggled with feelings they couldn't fully express or understand? Have you ever felt torn between instinct and empathy? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. The house on that December afternoon was filled with a quiet kind of light, pale gold and uncertain, much like Emily's mood. She stood by the kitchen window, gently stirring a cup of chamomile tea, a ritual she had adopted lately to hold on to some sense of calm. Ever since David left on a long work trip, one that had now stretched over 4 months, the house had felt missing a familiar kind of sound. No more clacking of his keyboard in the study, no more spontaneous whistling when he entered the kitchen in the morning. It was just her and Jack now. Jack was 21 this year, still living at home, attending college part-time, and working evenings at a nearby coffee shop. The boy who once clung to her side during every grocery run had grown tall, quiet, and often closed his bedroom door like it marked the entrance to a world she was no longer a part of. Emily knew there was nothing wrong with her son. Jack was polite, responsible, and had never caused her trouble. But it was precisely this silence that made the distance between them stretch a little further each day. Their dinners, when they happened, were usually filled with the clinking of cutlery against plates rather than the lively conversations of the past. She didn't blame Jack, but still a vague sadness crept in whenever she passed his closed door. This evening was no different. "Will you be home for dinner?" Emily called toward Jack's room, still folding napkins in the dining room. A pause, then a soft reply, "Yeah, probably. I get off early." A short answer, nothing unusual, but not quite enough to dissolve the quiet ache growing in her chest. She missed David, missed the way he'd pull up a chair beside her each night just to tell a few small stories from his day. Missed the way he'd glance at Jack and chuckle. "He's really grown, huh?" Now, with only mother and son in the house, the stillness no longer felt peaceful. It was more like a vacuum. Both of them were silently trying to fill with silence. That night's dinner was simple: chicken soup, bread, and a bit of salad. Emily set the table with little expectation of conversation, but to her surprise, Jack sat down on time. "I heard there's going to be an internship program in Boston," he said as he scooped his first spoonful of soup. Emily looked up, surprised by the sudden sharing. "Really? What do you think?" Jack shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Sounds okay. I haven't decided yet." "Boston's far," she said gently, trying not to let her emotions show. "But if it's something you want..." Jack nodded, his eyes flicking toward her for just a moment. They returned to their meal, but in that brief exchange, Emily sensed something had shifted, just slightly, just softly, like a crack in the wall between them had quietly opened. After washing the dishes, Emily leaned against the kitchen counter and looked out at the backyard. The night wind had picked up, spinning dry leaves in swirls across the ground. She suddenly realized maybe she wasn't lonely. Maybe she had simply grown so used to the silence that she'd forgotten how to listen to the smallest things within it. Around 9 p.m., Emily was halfway through a chapter of her novel on the sofa when she heard Jack's door open. Normally, he'd only come out to grab some water or head straight outside. But this time, Jack wandered slowly into the living room, still holding a mug of warm milk, a habit from childhood he hadn't quite outgrown. "Can't sleep?" Emily asked, her voice as soft as a breeze. Jack sat down in the armchair across from her and placed the mug on the glass table. "Probably because I studied all afternoon. My brain hasn't shut off yet." She smiled gently, marked her page, and closed the book, setting it aside. It was rare for her son to casually come out and start a conversation. "I remember when I was little," Jack began, eyes gazing into a vague distance. "Whenever I couldn't sleep, you let me lie on your lap and scratch my back until I drifted off." Emily's heart skipped a beat, not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. Clearly, tenderly, with something soft and vulnerable in his tone. She shifted slightly, smiling gently. It's been a while since we sat and talked like we used to, hasn't it? Jack chuckled softly, set his mug aside, and leaned back comfortably into the couch beside her. Emily was a bit surprised, but she sat quietly beside him, offering comforting words and a calming presence, as if no time had passed at all. The space around them softened like a thin blanket wrapping the whole room. The lamp cast a warm glow, the curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, and the ticking of the clock seemed to be the only sound still in motion. Emily didn't speak. She simply sat quietly by his side, offering silent reassurance through her calm presence. After a while, she heard Jack murmur, "I'm afraid that when Dad comes back, things won't be like this anymore." She looked at him softly. "What do you mean?" Jack was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "I've gotten used to Dad being away, and I'm not sure. I want everything to go back to how it was. It's not that I'm mad at him, it's just you and we've built a different life." Emily gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. She understood. In the silence, they had each adjusted to David's absence in their own way. And when someone has lived in that absence long enough, sometimes the return causes the deepest disruption. "No matter what happens, we still have each other, Jack," she said, softly, almost like a whisper. Jack gave a small nod, his shoulders relaxing as if he'd just set down a quiet burden. They stayed like that for a long while until Emily softly told him it was time for bed. Jack stood up without saying a word, but before leaving, he turned back and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thanks, Mom." Just 3 short words, but enough to warm her entire heart. As Jack's door clicked shut behind him, Emily remained seated on the sofa, reflecting quietly on their conversation and the closeness they shared. Sometimes, the deepest bonds don't come from grand declarations, but from the smallest of moments, when one person lets themselves be vulnerable and the other receives it with quiet grace. The next morning, the early sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the wooden floor of the living room where Emily had fallen asleep on the sofa. The book from the night before had slipped to the floor, lying open as if waiting for someone to continue reading. She rubbed her eyes, feeling a dull ache in her back, the price of dozing off in a sitting position all night. But the first thing that made her smile wasn't the sun or the birdsong outside the window, but the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. She walked into the kitchen and saw Jack, his hair still tousled, fiddling with the coffee machine and preparing 2 slices of toast. The sight made her heart skip a beat. "Good morning, Mom," Jack said without turning around. "I figured today you deserved to be served." Emily leaned lightly against the doorway, arms crossed. "A rare morning when you make the coffee, huh?" Jack smiled, placing a mug in front of her. "I slept better than usual last night." It was a simple sentence, but in his gaze, Emily could sense something shifting. He was no longer a little boy. He was a young man, growing up with new emotions and uncertainties about his place in the world. As they sat down at the table, Emily asked softly, "Have you thought more about what we talked about last night?" Jack was silent for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. Then he nodded gently. "I think what makes me feel lost isn't Dad being away. It's not knowing who I am without leaning on you." Emmy went still. That confession landed like a leaf touching ground in autumn, soft, yet stirring something deep. She understood that feeling. She had gone through something similar when David suddenly relocated for a long-term work assignment. For 3 years, she had taken on the role of both parents, and in all the busyness, she hadn't noticed how she, too, was slowly forgetting who she really was. "You don't need to have it all figured out right now," she said calmly. "But I believe that as long as you keep moving forward, no matter which direction you go, I'll always be right behind you." Jack looked up at her, his eyes slightly glossy. "I'm scared that if I go too far, you'll feel empty." Emily smiled, a smile both sad and tender. "I've been familiar with emptiness for a long time, Jack, but you're the one who's filled it, not by staying by my side every moment, but by growing up, by living your own journey." A quiet stillness settled over the small kitchen. Outside, late season petals drifted to the ground, signaling the turn of the season. And within Emily's heart, a shift was also underway between love and letting go, between protection and trust. Jack stood up and took the dishes to the sink. Before leaving the kitchen, he turned back and said softly, "You know, Mom, I think I want to try living more independently. Maybe get another job or move out for a while." Emily froze for a moment, her heart aching. But she didn't let herself cling. She only nodded gently. "As long as you stay true to yourself, I'll always be here, the home you can return to." Seasonal transitions always carry a kind of hazy feeling, part loss, part hope. And in the small kitchen of a home no longer complete with three, Emily and Jack were stepping into a new season of life. One where love isn't measured by proximity, but by growth and mutual understanding. The house felt quieter after Jack left that morning. Emily remained in the living room, her fingers gently tracing the rim of a now cold cup of coffee. Her son's words still echoed in her mind. His desire to live independently, to walk on his own. She was proud of Jack for growing up, but within that pride, an emptiness had begun to open. Vast, boundless, and cold like the late autumn air. She stood up and walked toward the small study near the back porch, the place where she and David used to sit and sort through paperwork or read books on the weekends. The room still carried the scent of old wood, and dim light filtered through the dusty glass window. On the top shelf, a small wooden box caught her eye, the one David had left before he departed, telling her to only open it when she truly felt the need. Emily had never touched it, but this morning, with the shifting season in her heart and a fresh wave of loneliness swelling, she found herself stepping forward, gently pulling the box down. Her fingers trembled as she opened the lid. Inside were letters, photographs, and a notebook bearing David's handwriting. "For you, in case one day you need to remember why we began." She froze, breath caught in her chest. Each page was filled with that familiar, careful handwriting, neat, deliberate, and tender, just like David himself. He wrote about their early days at university, about the first rainy night when Emily finally agreed to hold his hand in the library. One page recounted the day Jack was born, his words shaky, the ink slightly smudged from trembling hands as he wrote after seeing their son for the first time. "My love, if you're reading this, then something must be weighing heavily on your heart. But please remember, you are the strongest woman I have ever known. You gave me a home, became a mother, a friend, and the keeper of our flame during every time I was away. And if Jack ever confuses you, just remember, we were once like that too, learning how to love in our own way, clumsily, but with all our hearts." Emily closed the notebook, tears silently falling onto her hands. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to fully remember David, not just as the father who was away, not just as a shadow in an old room, but as the man who had once loved her with everything he had. She stepped out into the backyard where a few small lavender shoots still remained, planted by Jack long ago. The wind swept through her hair, soft and gentle, like an embrace from a distant memory. She closed her eyes and quietly whispered her thanks. To David, for the days they once shared, and to Jack, the son who was slowly becoming himself in his own way. The face of memory isn't only found in photos and letters or old journal pages. It lives in Jack's eyes when he smiles, in the warmth of his voice, and in the way he looked at her that morning, hesitant yet strong. Emily knew that the journey of motherhood was never easy, especially when it meant learning how to love while slowly letting go. And sometimes to truly see the face of memory, you have to touch it with courage and a heart that is learning how to heal. That evening, Emily prepared a simple dinner, chicken soup, Jack's favorite since he was little. As he walked into the kitchen, the warm aroma drifted through the air like a thread pulling time backward to the days when he was a quiet boy, sketching at the table while she cooked. They didn't speak much. It was just a peaceful dinner, but within that peace, something was shifting. After the meal, Jack helped her with the dishes, then sat down on the bench out on the back porch. Emily brought 2 cups of hot ginger tea and handed one to her son. She sat beside him, and together they looked up at the night sky, where the stars shimmered in rhythm with the breeze. Do you remember the summer camp when you were 12? Emily asked, her voice soft but laden with meaning. Jack smiled. The first time I got lost in the woods, you ran around looking for me like crazy. I remember. They both laughed. It wasn't a loud or long laugh, but it was real, like a small stream running through the chest, washing away distance. That's when I realized, Emily said slowly, that everyone you love will eventually reach a moment you can't protect them from anymore. The only thing you can give them is this, the right to choose. Jack turned to look at her. And you're going to let me go? She nodded. Not to leave, but to go your own way. Though sometimes I'll miss the days when it was just the two of us. I'll miss them deeply. Jack looked at her thoughtfully, nodding slowly as he absorbed her words, reminding her of the gentle boy he once was. I'm scared of change too, Mom, he said quietly. I'm used to living by your side, being understood without needing to explain, but I know I have to learn how to love in a more grown-up way. We're learning together, my dear, Emily replied, her eyes blurred with tears, though her lips held a smile. Learning how to grow up, but still keep a tender heart. The night breeze rustled through the trees, making the leaves gently tremble. In that fragile air, the mother and son sat close. Not as a woman burdened by duty and a boy growing up amidst confusion, but as two souls learning how to give each other space to grow, to step back without letting go, held together by an unspoken thread. There were no binding promises, no grand decisions, just a gentle choice to honor feelings, to keep the heart soft, and to remain present in each other's lives. In a new way, a more mature way, but still full of love. It rained softly through the night. The next morning, Emily woke earlier than usual. She didn't draw the curtains right away, but sat down at the small writing desk by the window, the very spot where David used to sit and read every Sunday morning. Today, instead of a hot cup of coffee, there was a stack of blank paper and an old fountain pen she hadn't used in ages. As she began to write, Dear Jack, if one day you happen to read these lines, it might mean I've found the courage to give them to you, or perhaps I've kept them simply to lighten my heart a little. I'm not writing because I think you need an explanation. You're grown now, perceptive enough to understand many things that don't need to be spoken aloud. But there are feelings I can't express through everyday conversations, so I write. I write to silently send you a part of myself, a part I've never said out loud. Since your father left for his extended war trip, there have been voids that felt impossible to fill. I've adjusted to managing things independently, and your presence has been a comforting support. But familiarity doesn't mean loneliness isn't there. There were nights when I wished someone would reassure me softly, saying everything's gonna be okay. And then you appeared, not saying it but doing it, with your eyes, with your calm presence that listened so intently. At times, I was worried about depending too heavily on your support and kindness. I worried I might be relying on you emotionally in ways that were unfair or too heavy for you. But then I understood it wasn't anyone's fault. We were navigating difficult times together, loss, adjustment, and the importance of mutual understanding. I am proud of you, a young man who listens with his heart. And if one day you ever feel weighed down by the closeness between us, I hope you'll remember this. Love is not a chain, it's a door. When someone truly loves you, they will open the door for you to walk out without rushing, without reproach, only wishing that you'll live true to yourself. Emily set down the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, overcome by rising emotions. She folded the letter, placed it into the desk drawer. Unsealed, unnamed, just a piece of her heart written down, enough to soothe a part of the storm within. That evening, Jack came home late. He passed by the study and caught a glimpse of his mother reading by the window. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, but that look was enough. They both understood something had shifted, not between them, but within each of them. In that moment, the silence was no longer a distance. It was a gentle bridge, drawing their souls quietly closer. A week later, the sun broke through after a long stretch of damp, overcast days. Golden light streamed through the glass windows, gently covering the porch where Emily was wiping down her little potted plants. She took a quiet breath, feeling a soft note of calm settle in her chest. Jack stepped out with 2 mugs of hot lemon tea. He handed one to his mother, then sat down on the wooden chair beside her. Neither of them spoke right away. There were only the sounds of chirping birds and the gentle warmth of the early sun brushing through their fingers. I read something strange yesterday, Jack began, his voice low and light, as if speaking to the air. It said that sometimes when people lose something familiar, they start loving what remains in the strangest ways. Emily tilted her head toward him. What do you mean? Jack took a small sip of tea, eyes fixed on the garden. I think sometimes our mother-son bond grows stronger precisely because we've supported each other through difficult times. And we're forced to grow up, to learn how to love a person as a person, not just someone who existed in our memories. Emily sat still. Jack's words weren't quite an accusation, nor forgiveness. They sounded more like a soft, sad melody echoing in the quiet of midday. Were you ever angry at your father? She asked, her gaze steady. Jack let out a long breath. Yes, but then I realized if I kept holding on to that anger, there wouldn't be any room left for the people who remained. Emily turned to look at him. She could see David's face in Jack's. Not in his features, but in the calm, prematurely wise way he spoke. But what made her throat tighten wasn't the resemblance. It was what David had never done. Sit beside her, truly listening. She looked at Jack warmly, offering a reassuring smile. I know I've leaned on you more than I should have. I support you because I genuinely care and appreciate everything you've done, Jack replied, offering her a comforting nod and a warm look. But because I care about you, genuinely. In that moment, beneath the clear morning sunlight on the porch, they were no longer just mother and grown-up child. They were two souls. Once hurt, once hardened, once lost. Learning how to simply be beside each other, peacefully. A story doesn't always need a climax. Sometimes, just a small moment, like sunlight brushing the trembling hand of someone near, like the heart calming down because it has been seen, understood, and accepted, is enough to be called a rebirth. Spring arrived later than usual. The branches in the backyard had only just begun to bud when Emily folded the last wool sweater and tucked it neatly into the storage box. She stood up, wiped her hands on a thin apron, and silently looked out the window, where Jack was busy fixing up the old flower bed David used to tend. It had been more than 3 months since they last sat together on the porch. 3 months wasn't long, but just enough for Emily to learn how to stand on her own, even with Jack still by her side. A young man who had quietly grown, strong and silent like trees lining a roadside. That evening, while the two of them were tidying up the storage room, Jack picked up an old wooden box. He sat cross-legged on the floor, opened the lid, and let out a soft chuckle. The first letter Dad ever wrote to you, Jack said, his eyes lighting up as he pulled out the yellowed paper. Emily paused, then sat beside him. Your father used to be the kind of man who wrote letters by hand, she smiled. Back then, that alone was enough to make my heart flutter. Jack read the first few lines, then handed her the letter. I think you should keep this. Emily took it, her hand slightly trembling. The letter was a part of her memory, but it no longer hurt like it used to. Now, it was a deep note in the music of her life. Not something to forget, just something to let go. That night, as the cool breeze drifted in through the open window, Emily pulled out a new journal. On the first page, she wrote in steady letters. The day to begin again. She wrote about the quiet mornings, about Jack and the small changes he was going through, about a house that no longer had David but still carried warm, living breasts. She wrote to remind herself that love didn't have to come from grand gestures. Sometimes it was simply a meal cooked together, a hug at the end of the day, or a glance of understanding without a single word. As Emily finished writing, she heard Jack's footsteps approaching. "I think I'll sign up for an evening art class," Jack said. "Not because I'm good at it, but because I want to try something just for myself." Emily smiled warmly, her eyes conveying deep pride and affection. "That's what I've been hoping you'd do all along." Outside, the wind began to shift. The young leaves trembled gently, like a whisper from the new season brushing against the eaves. And in Emily's heart, a place once thought barren began to green again. Not because the pain had vanished, but because love had found another way to bloom. There are pains that don't need to be erased, only held gently with acceptance and tenderness. Emily and Jack didn't try to forget David, nor did they attempt to replace what was lost. They learned how to move forward with memory, how to love each other in a new version, more mature, more empathetic, and freer. Healing is not about forgetting, but about learning to live with old wounds without letting them define us. And sometimes the most beautiful things don't come from grand beginnings, but from quiet steps taken inside a familiar home with a loved one waiting just beyond the door. If this story touched a part of your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your journey, even just a small piece of it. And if you believe in the power of connection and healing, don't forget to like and subscribe to join us in future stories. Because everyone deserves to be heard, and no one should have to walk forward alone.